2012, I contacted the CLR James Library in Dalston Junction, East London. At the time, the library was closing down and moving to a new location. I could see through the old library windows that their carpet tiles, red and grey alternate squares, remained in the empty space and would probably be discarded. I liked the idea that a future use of the carpet would somehow archive the space as having been red and contribute in some unconscious way to links I was trying to make between textuality and place. I particularly wanted the tiles trodden from the human psychology section. The library agreed to give me 300 carpet tiles to use in a future installation. The floor tiles were loaded into a van at the old library on 16th of July 2012 and arrived at my studio where I met them. I was unable to lift much as I was scheduled to give birth 2 days later. The library, in a bid to save cash and get rid of all the remaining tiles, had loaded more than 2,000 carpet tiles into their van. I could not lift, handle or store these in my studio, and Tower Hamlets Council would not take them. They were classified as industrial waste, but I am not classified as an industry. I contacted Hackney Council as I lived in the borough, but they pointed out that if I took the tiles home, they would then have to be reclassified as domestic waste, which they couldn't be because they were not domestic. They would not be picked up. I was stuck. My 2,000 tile-strong waste had fallen between two categories and could not truly become waste. The only way to get the carpet tiles out of the van so that the drivers could continue with their day was to put them outside my flat, where they remained until I went into hospital 2 days later. The tiles filled a walled-in area at the front of the shared property and spilled out onto the busy street. Realising that the Olympic torch was due to be paraded in front of the flat and TV cameras on the 21st of July with pomp and fanfare, I enlisted the help of the original drivers to take the tiles, now rain-soaked and twice their original weight, back to the library at night. This was organised from the delivery room at Homerton Hospital. The carpet tiles were, without ceremony, dumped where they had originated. The odd lives of objects, from manufacture to use to obsolescence, are tied up in this story. The tiles had been the footstep of library research for years, and somehow those footsteps ended up in wet stacks in my garden. I had intended the tiles to be a signifier of the archival, classificatory side to my work, but they ended up as unclassifiable clutter. They were almost the backdrop to a public parade of a bespoke design object making its final journey to the newly built Olympic Park, and, had she come home with us in that strange week in July, would have been the sodden backdrop to my daughter's homecoming. The carpet tiles implicated my domestic life in my research into hoarding that I had, to date, kept far from my own, less problematised relationship to amassing things. The feeling of encroachment was profound. Mine is a collagist form of research. Alongside visual materials and fiction, I use theory as a malleable material component. I'm going to talk about diagnosis via space. Hoarding disorder is currently the only named condition where diagnosis comes via space. I'm going to look at 4 types of spaces. The first, a metaphorical space between archaeology and the mind. The second, a hoard, as it is seen through the lens of its diagnosis. The third, the modern city in relation to the beginnings of agoraphobia. And finally, the fourth, the potential for this stage to swallow me as a fictive space where I could construct an elsewhere if surrounded by the right materials and imported narrative. Within collage, the point of an element's origin can remain unknown. Its severed relationship to an original location is often substituted by new relationships drawn across the fault line, and in this way, elements hold references to their past, but through conjoining, expose this history to the evolution of a new and potentially jarring narrative, a new origin or moment of production. To think of shifts in emergence as the re-originating of any composite work allows the collagist to build a relationship with history, or histories, and indeed their reimagining. For many collagists, this is a determining factor in their engagement with materials and their reappropriations. Martha Rosler talks of her collages as works that ruffle the taxonomy by which we understand our world. This is research in and about layers, and perhaps obvious psychiatric, archaeological and architectural metaphorical equivalencies exist there. It makes sense, having introduced the idea of connecting layers within collage, to introduce the analogy of Freudian analysis as an archaeological position, as it could relate to the hoard as a petrifying mound and its potential to signify disorder. Freud's own early affiliations with archaeology were referred to throughout his working life, although he later on picked them in a distancing from the directness of his analogy. In his treatment of Sergei Pankachev, known as the Wolf Man, because of the pertinence of his most significantly analysed dream, he iterated, "The psychoanalyst, like the archaeologist in his excavations, must uncover layer after layer of the patient's psyche before coming to the deepest, most valuable treasures." It's useful to refer back to the notion that an archaeological impulse values digging for or uncovering lost treasure, recognising it, labelling it. To be literal, in archaeology, what rises to the surface is dirty, needing to be brushed off and cleaned. Freud's metaphor also refers to this aspect of recovery and to the changes inherent in the past through experience, interpretation, and an application of the present. In both psychological and archaeological practices, the object-subject has experienced some wear, tear, and review, manifesting evidence of its burial alongside its past, subsequent diagnosis and recovery. I'm interested here in the separation of feeling from telling, the idea that potentised non-linguistic truths rise to the surface where they then potentially decode. In his writings about Freud, Stefan Zweig, the Austrian author and longtime friend of the psychoanalyst, remarks that the analyst has to deal with, and this is a quote, "what looks like a plot of ground on which there has been put up a notice, rubbish may be shot here. Out of the great heap of rubbish, out of this accumulated mass of unsorted vital experience, out of these thousands of memories and remarks and accounts of dreams, the doctor has, by a psychological sifting process, to select the wheat from the chaff, or perhaps, I had better say, the fragments of mineral ore from the rubble. Then by a lengthy smelting, he must extract the true metal, must separate the psychoanalytic material from the residue. He must never credulously accept the unsmelted ore of the narration as pure metal." End of quote. Despite its resonance with his contemporaries, at the end of his life, Freud revisited his analogy with archaeology, referring to the complexities of these rearrangements, and that psychical objects are incomparably more complicated than the excavator's material ones. Their finer structure contains so much that is still mysterious. Collage, too, attaches discrete value systems to what goes unseen or is reconstituted to form a new whole. Obscured layers are alluded to, but materially undermined through their disappearance. Some layers are kept away from the surface, and their obfuscation can indicate a secrecy or unsafety in being viewed. But digging cannot always be assumed to reveal treasure, just as cleaning cannot be assumed to de-objectify what has been unearthed. What is typically uncovered in the deepest layers of a hoard is generally not considered of great value to anyone but the hoarder. It is often eroded matter, mould, dirt, excrement, and undefined coagulated entropic material, or simply stuff of little economic or collective value. The perceived value of the hoard is alluded to in diagnostics. The American Psychiatric Association's definition of hoarding disorder is a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of the value others may attribute to these possessions. And that definition came about in May 2013, which was the first time that hoarding disorder became a stand-alone disorder. Whilst an analysis of the hoarder can value what is buried and add insight to the activity, an analysis of the hoard itself would almost invariably reveal layers of decreasing worth according to profundity. So the lower you go, the more likely you are to find something that's of less value than at the top, unlike potentially in archaeology. To dig down is also to move backwards psychologically and attach value once more to what is essentially waste. It is to regress to be the archaeologist of a hoard. There is also inherent practical danger to the process of excavation. The very real threat of excess and the precariousness of its storage makes it a self-destroying mechanism, subject to its own erosion and coagulation, but also implicating human occupants and visitors in this destruction. Archaeological metaphors used with regard to psychoanalysis and the unearthing, therefore, of valuable psychical material may be unuseful to understanding a hoard or excessive accumulation. Re-engagement with materials relives the problematised experience of their safeguarding and repeats psychological processes at the heart of its pathology. Digging reveals loss via a changed or an altered entropic element, which is ultimately non-revelatory in terms of its initial attraction, and therefore could become a move backwards psychologically. There's danger in profundity in this location, where what is at the bottom cannot be retrieved without practical risk. Popular opinion presumes the polar existences of psychopathology, hoarding, or seeming rationale, collection. On this spectrum, the hoard can be viewed as a spatialisation of mental disorder and the collection as a rational, orderly, aestheticised pursuit, or spatialisation of mental order. Looking into the condition of hoarding disorder, I found it to be the only mental health condition diagnosed spatially, the hoard itself substituting the presence and account of the hoarder. I unearthed critical theoretical implications that were embedded in the tools of its diagnosis, and my research itself became a collage in many media. It's taken on disciplinary cross-contaminations as collagist, and in keeping actually with the analysis of the hoard. Through engaging with collation as a subject and method, it's creating a platform for interpreting the materials within one discipline as they overlap into the specialisms of another. I have necessarily needed to examine, alongside hoarding disorder, complex ways in which criteria for establishing the language, diagnostics and spatialisation of new disorders, or those that are given new names, have developed historically. And this extends to an examination of photographic tools in relation to diagnoses of hysteria. And we've done quite a lot of looking at that today, so I'm only going to touch on that lightly here. It also included the roles of space and the modern city in the emergence of agoraphobia, and in relation to how we look at disorder via culture, a questioning of the borders between asylum and museum. Each of these circumstances is looked at in relation to the building of scientific and cultural vocabularies around this newly defined condition, so taking it an example of how conditions are formed, within which image making, spatial theory, and the collation of objects all became key concerns. So I'm going to try to condense this bit because it picks up on some of the things that have already come up. In his book, Invention of Hysteria, Charcot and the Photographic Iconography of the Salpêtrière, cultural theorist Georges Didier Huberman discusses the problem of assigning an aesthetic to a disorder. He describes Charcot's documentary evidence as dramaturgy, and his archive as the anchoring of photography in fiction. So the temporality of his supposed hysterical attack is very much at odds with the 19th century camera's need for a still posed model, and the lie is bound, therefore, to the technologies of the day. The posed model, potential studio setups, and its requirements of planning, equipment, economics, and location all become a part of this dramaturgy, and therefore the making of representational objects from the point of departure. Didier Huberman extends this to include the stage directions, the legend or text through which Charcot's evidence was explained. And this dramaturgy has persisted in contemporary clinical diagnostic models, and that's what I want to go on to now. So hoarding experts, Randy O. Frost, I know he sounds like an ice cream salesman every time I say it, Randy O. Frost and Gail Steckerty were part of the work group defining hoarding disorder as a standalone condition in 2013. And they wrote in their book, Stuff, that to make sure that we had an accurate way to assess clutter, we set out to develop a non-verbal measure that did not rely on the word. The result of the project was a series of 9 photographs depicting clutter in each room. We use this clutter image rating, as we now call it, in most of our ongoing research. It gives us an unambiguous marker of the seriousness of the problem and clarifies the word clutter in the world of hoarding. So just to kind of, I don't know how much of this you can see, but there's 9 images, and just the second line down says, please select the photo below that most accurately reflects the amount of clutter in your room. And this is how hoarders are popularly diagnosed, particularly in the US, by pointing to a picture in clinic. Hoarding, in its definition, comes without insight. It has no insight from patients. That's how there's a kind of sort of triage system of how you can be insightful about your own condition. And hoarding comes up as having low or no insight. So you're normally, if you're a hoarder, you might be referred by a family friend, a neighbour, someone living below. And so this sort of pointing becomes deeply problematic. So intriguingly, Frost and Steckety did not use images of genuine hoards, but constructs that they set up in student housing and photographed, later calling them accurate. In the images, clutter builds in strange ways. It gathers on the floor before surfaces are used, and does not gather according to the original function of the room. So, for example, there are no plates or cups on the table in the kitchen in the initial image. Early in the sequence of images, a picture on a bedroom wall goes wonky without anything coming close to it to knock it. This unstraightening is not an early sign of excessive accumulation, and it provides an odd insight into the construction of the space. Students are apparently hidden in this stuff, crouching and unseen at the back of some of these images. As underlined through an examination of Charcot's studies, Frost terming his photographic imagery as unambiguous in its illustration of a disorder is not a new rationale within diagnostics, and nor is it within the history of the photo document. Siegfried Krakauer wrote of archived photography that it could only ever serve to authenticize or tell of the moment of its specific production, rather than of the truth of the subject, from which it has been dislocated. This eradication of personal memory or experience allows that, and this is Krakauer, I'm quoting here, the photograph gathers fragments around a nothing, excluding us from its fragmented content through severed signifiers. The photograph's image, once separated physically or historically from its subject, wanders ghost-like through the present. Using photography scientifically, anthropologically, clinically, or as proof is of course shaky ground. Didi Uberman put it best in a typically poetic manner when he wrote, "Photography delivers us in all senses, its superb materialist myth, the filmy production of the double, in fact constitutes the passing to the limits of evidence, exacerbated, multiplied, magnified. Evidence passes into simulacrum." There are my simulacra. The hoarder is therefore conceptualised via the hoard, the owner or occupant subsumed into a reflection of self via objects and space. It is perhaps a success of the condition in that the stuff has effected a takeover, and in separating hoard from hoarder, there are suddenly many possibilities regarding its analysis within the terms of critical theory of the psychology of spaces. Clinically assigned traits of a hoard are not solely the misplacement or stockpiling of objects of questionable value, so cannot solely be aestheticised, but include impairment of mobility and physical negotiation of a space. That also includes hygiene in some cases. It is valuable, therefore, to consider how other disorders connected to space may have come into definition. I am just going to point to the current state of my home because I feel it's imperative. I think it's probably about there. So it can be done in a fiction. Okay. The psychopathologizing of the modern city in response to growing anxiety disorders, mental disturbance and phobic fears became a popularly held notion from the 1870s, a theory upheld by many physicians, mind doctors, social commentators and even architects of the city. The mid to late 19th century saw increased instances of this street fear first notably defined as agoraphobia by the German psychologist Karl Otto Westphal in 1871. Its symptoms, which often occurred in public spaces, included dizziness, shaking, hot flushes, and fear of death. Of course, it is quite possible that the recording of a surge in such anxieties correlates directly with a burgeoning psychoanalytic field. The coincidence in time and space of social and psychological analysis and modernity becomes located within the disorder. The chronologising of effects of living in the modern city is thus simultaneously spatial and exacerbated by the growth of disciplines that were inclined to document it. 19th and early 20th century debates around the onset of such phobia have been written about extensively by architectural and spatial theorists concerned with unconscious and subjective readings of space. Metropolis, by the First World War, had become a word that implied both a physical site and a pathological state, which for better or for worse epitomised modern life, writes Anthony Fiedler, who's an architectural theorist. The anxieties of the metropolis validated urban critics, who bemoaned its degradation of the social undermining of individual responsibilities and the potential unsafety of the crowd. Famously, the Austrian architect Camillo Sitter, in his nostalgia for the traditional city square and critique of the development of Vienna's Ringstrasse, suggested in 1898 that even people formed out of stone and metal on their monumental pedestals are attacked by this malady. The idea that a condition of modernity induces psychological trauma in statues underlines the threat to history seen by metropolitan disorder. To Sitter, a fear of spaces was sociological, a direct response to modern urbanism, and not to an underlying pathology. He iterated the emotional importance of walls to social comfort and protested the takedown of Vienna's ramparts that would open the city up to becoming a metropolis with spaces for rich and poor bleeding into one another. Despite the attacks levelled at the modern city for causing psychological disturbance among its populations, Jean-Martin Charcot and fellow neurologist and protégé Gilles de la Tourette saw agoraphobia, claustrophobia and vertigo as hereditary. They saw them as neuropathic states that in reality constitute distinct and autonomous morbid species. In tandem, William James, writing on the same subject, suggested that these spatial fears were passed to man from animal behaviours and rituals associated with hunt and prey. He talked about animals venturing out on a dash across the open as a desperate measure and related that to these fears of open space. Instances of agoraphobia have always been more prevalent among women. It is still incredibly referred to commonly as housewives' disease. Over 85% of cases are said to be female agoraphobes, and in lieu of this, and despite much of the literature of the day focusing on case studies of male patients, Freud took an opposing view to reigning positions on hereditary or spatial causes. He looked at how many female agoraphobes there were and saw spatial anxieties directly linked to female sexual abnormalities, referring to agoraphobia and anxieties around the street as specific to a romanticising of prostitution and its inner repression as a desire, or fear of a sufferer's own potential infidelity and choices. Thus, the street as a social site and not open space, with all its emptiness, becomes the threat. So space itself was therefore symptomatic, not causal. It is not hard, in fact, to see how the street could be a site of anxiety for repressed or sheltered women coming out of the home. For Freud, space could not be the root cause of anxiety to an agoraphobe, as much as internal danger is transformed into an external one. In his phobia, he makes a displacement and is now afraid of an external situation. Leading female Freudian psychoanalysts of the first half of the 20th century, which included Helena Deutsch and Annie Catan, tended to align themselves with Freud's thesis on agoraphobia, and Deutsch does refer to the temptations of the street as a leading factor in the agoraphobic tendencies she observed in her practice. She noted, the street constitutes a special danger to exhibitionist impulses. Expanding the idea of repression existing at the heart of spatial anxiety, Esther da Costa has described how, for Freud, space per se was incidental to the disease. Importantly, some of these writers at the time that were analysing the disorder reposition repressions manifested within agoraphobia, aligning them not with spatial readings but their anchoring within capitalism. Correlations of class, gender and ethnicity to the emergence of phobias in urban space highlight the links between pathology and society. Mayer underlines Freud's successful assertions of the components of the symptomology of agoraphobia, but also his failure to make these societal connections, particularly with regard to women and the home. So whilst the home of Freudian analysis was not always secure, Freud did not extend this language to a gendered understanding of societal repression and the potential for anxiety compounded by the opening up of space and choices to women. Okay, so another really, really important factor in terms of thinking about histories of agoraphobia, we need to look at the origin of the marketplace, actually, and a sort of how what a reasonable response to the sickness of the urban scene might be, and whether cities themselves were making people feel unwell. So Freud himself talked of feeling agoraphobic in heavy traffic, but it was not in the first instance thought to be, by himself, his own unruly instinctual drives. It was due to a more mundane and measurable form of driving, the immensely increased volume and accelerated pace of traffic in Vienna's newly enlarged roads and squares. So in my focus on agoraphobia here, I'm really asking, can space make us ill? So here is the safety and interior spaces that could fit pathological definitions of hoarding disorder, sort of safety at home, building things up at home to feel safe, and staying in terms of agoraphobia. In my own work, I'm writing into complex, disorderly, psychical spaces outside the confines of the home, though. Other kinds of inhabited, engaged in spaces, such as workplaces, exercise classes, museums, theatres and malls, both built and half-built. The city, of course, is not always the street or square, as discussions of agoraphobia might imply, but the agora itself, which is a marketplace. A fear of the market implies a fear of consumption. As our homes grow increasingly merged with marketplaces and themselves commodified, it's harder to see the walls between outside and in. And intriguingly, instances of agoraphobia are in rapid decline. So this eroding boundary between home and the marketplace is referred to as a kind of fragile or illusory frontier or border between domestic and urban space that agoraphobes hang on to, the nerve-wracked kind of angst-ridden threshold within which they sort of retrench themselves. And as a new disorder or set of disorders is classified and considered, questions are asked at the time about whether contemporary life is causing or exacerbating them into being or prevalence. These are questions being asked about hoarding, as indeed they were about agoraphobia, and these disorders share a relationship to lived-in space alongside societal questions about inclusion, commerce, environment, and economics, actually, and what is public or private space. New disciplines emerge at the borders of these factors. So there's a subtext to the question about whether space can make us ill, and it is whether space could be said to be making us ill. This question concerns the languages and disciplines of classification. Early definitions of agoraphobia took shape in Central Europe against a backdrop of the new emerging disciplines of urban sociology and psychoanalysis. Via agoraphobia, we can access how a disorder comes to be formed, that is, how language is applied and how clinical and non-clinical arguments are posited side by side. Through an engagement with each other, certain coalitions were formed, drawing upon others such as literature and abstraction, and we came to think of psychical space and the city's unconscious. It's a chicken and egg scenario, prompting me to implicate pathology and disorder in a clash of historical, sociological, architectural fields, pushing our understanding of knowledge production and the formation of phenomenology. So this too then is collage. I'm thinking through hoarding disorder as aesthetic, spatial, museological, archival, archaeological and environmental, adding these to the production of terms associated with the generating of newness, of new naming around a psychological condition. And this historical example of agoraphobia is really useful. It's a model for how a cultural situation becomes both implicated in the awakening of a condition into public consciousness, and how that condition itself then produces culture. Colette A. Colette A's dark corridor linked the worlds of. Colette A died at 101, having been a recluse for decades, simply living at the back of her large apartment. By the end of her life, she had reached a point where she never opened her house at all. The last complete example of a decorative epoch. An interior in which nothing at all had changed. Lovingly maintained. Stamped with the marks of great cabinet makers, a very beautiful bedroom with a wooden bed lacquered in gold leaf. By the end of her life, she was living very simply at the rear of her enormous apartment, made to measure silk covers, protect them from the light, an air of extreme refinement. Colette A. She never opened the shutters at all to protect the rooms from light and dust. She was the prisoner of a decor that she could barely bring herself to touch. Panelling for her Paris apartment. Deeply suspicious of strangers. A fur counterpane and matching poufs. The satins that cover the chairs. Colette A was the sole guardian of her treasure, living in perpetual darkness in a converted maid's room, stuffed willy-nilly with furniture, curios and keepsakes of all descriptions, cluttering up the room. When she was away from Paris, she had the windows and the shutters closed and tightly packed, with hundreds of folded pieces of paper to stop the least particle of dust or light coming in. Within a few days of Colette A's death, the apartment was stripped bare, dismantled, packed up and taken away.